and talk about your article here about what's going on in Afghanistan. I think the Pentagon finally try to come up or give us some details on not the drone strike in Kabul, which we have, covered extensively, but the one that happened in Nangarhar just a few days before.
Yeah, correct. So yeah, we have devoted quite a bit of coverage to the U.S. drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 civilians, 7 children. The Pentagon had initially tried to deny that. Later, they said, okay, maybe it was 3 civilians, and then ultimately, I think you explained in the show last week, they've now admitted that, okay, yeah, we only killed civilians in this strike, mostly children, zero terrorists, or no ISIS fighters. So that one was on August 29th. And I think that was actually the final American bombing in the country before we fully withdrew. However, a couple days before the Kabul strike, we also launched one in Nangarhar province, further to the east in Afghanistan. And I believe it was in the provincial capital of Jalalabad, but I'm not totally sure about the exact town. I think that's what I had read. And both of these strikes were supposed to be in response to that huge suicide bombing at the Kabul airport earlier in August. And so we've said and heard a lot about that second one in Kabul, but the military had not said too much about that one in Nangarhar since it happened. However, now after nearly a month, CENTCOM has finally come out last week, and they have identified the person that they killed in that strike. I guess maybe they felt compelled to do that, given that the Kabul operation was botched so badly. And of course, they are saying that the guy in Nangarhar was definitely 100% a terrorist and a member of ISIS, and not a little kid and not a civilian aid worker. They're trying to stress very much that he's a bad guy, and they named him as a Kabir Aidi. They said he went by an alias Mustafa, which is a very uncommon name in Afghanistan, I'm sure, Mustafa. And they say he was some kind of high-level quote facilitator and quote attack planner, and he was involved in producing IEDs, and they claim that he was part of a so-called threat stream in Kabul, by which I guess they mean that he was supposedly, helping to plan an attack there in the capital. And the CENTCOM statement was kind of weird. It was like it's a weird mixture of like highly specific and very vague. Like they say that he was involved specifically in quote magnetic IED production, but then they can't or won't really explain like how he was tied into the supposed Kabul threat stream, and they give us no evidence whatsoever of how they know that this guy was affiliated with ISIS. And like we should recall that before the Pentagon had to make a total reversal and admit that that other drone strike in Kabul just killed a bunch of innocent civilians and children, they had used a lot of the same verbiage. They said that this guy was an ISIS facilitator, that he visited ISIS safe houses, that he was probably carrying explosives in his car, and that he posed a direct threat to the Kabul airport. That was their story at first, before they admitted that, okay, actually, no, this was actually just a massacre of a random family in a residential neighborhood in Kabul. And even before that, they had tried to come up with some bullshit excuse about how they didn't kill the civilians, but some secondary explosions triggered by bombs in the vehicle. That's what did it. And we now know by their own admission that whole narrative was false, that there were no secondary blasts. And in my opinion, that was more likely a lie than a mistake, and that the only reason they had to actually admit the Kabul strike was such a failure was because the media in that case actually did its job, and they basically proved that no ISIS fighters were killed in that strike. Like we talked about that pretty good New York Times investigation that threw cold water on most of their story. So given all that, like I absolutely do not buy what the military is now saying about this guy that they killed in Nangarhar. Like I'm not saying it's definitely not true. Maybe he was an ISIS guy, but I'm not going to take CENTCOM's word alone before I believe that. Like we saw exactly how they came up with a BS story about the one in Kabul and how quickly that could change. And so there's clearly a pretty strong incentive here on behalf of CENTCOM to say at least one of these strikes, was something other than a disaster. These were like our very final acts in the longest war in American history. For those to be botched so badly, I think there's some like symbolism there. So I think the Pentagon really has an interest to say that like one of these was not a failure.
Yeah, that's all great points, Will. And anything else we know about this guy or the attack at all, or is that pretty much all the details we have now? And anybody reporting on this so far?
I haven't seen much subsequent reporting. I did try to look up the guy that they named Kabir Aidi, and I didn't see any obvious hits. So apparently, it was not a very high profile. Like they used those exact words, say he was high profile, but apparently has not appeared much in English language media. Now, the Pentagon does claim that he was involved in previous attacks. I think they said he tried to attack the university in Kabul last November. But again, they provided no evidence for that. It's purely a claim. So pretty much all we have on this is claims from the Pentagon.